Hi guys, welcome back to part 3 in my series on how to paint a 54mm Roman legionary. Now, I'm just going to keep my introduction here brief. If you want a more extensive kind of look at this whole project and some general tips on how to paint stuff in 54mm, I would recommend you check out the introduction at the beginning of part 1, which I will link to in the description box here, along with a link to part 2. So just to bring everyone up to date with what we've done, in part 1 we painted the face and hands on the model along with his tunic and pants, and then in part 2 we did the interior of his cloak, his chainmail shirt, and his kind of leg wrappings. This week we're going to be focusing on how to paint sort of the furry part of that pelt he's wearing, but also then a lot of just little details that need to get done in order to finish the model, like his boots and his belt, his sword, his dagger, all that kind of small stuff that is, it doesn't actually take all that long to paint, but it is very, very important for getting a nice finished looking model. So as always, here are the paints you're going to need. There's probably quite a bit of overlap from last week, so, hopefully that'll be helpful when you go to buy paints, but there are indeed a few different colors here. You'll notice there's no glaze medium this time. That's just because this particular section involves quite a bit of detail work, and so the blending we need to do is not as extensive, and I didn't find that the glaze medium was basically as necessary in this case. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started with the painting in part 3. I'm going to begin by base coating the kind of furry part of his pelt, and the mixture I'm using here is Vallejo dark blue gray with just a bit of black in it, because I think dark blue gray by itself is not quite dark enough for the base coat, and I just want to get a little bit more contrast there. So now I'm going to start highlighting this cloak, and you may be wondering, well, this is a different kind of surface with all these sort of hair texture things going on. How do you tackle highlighting something like this? And at least initially, I found the best answer is to really approach it like you're painting a normal smooth surface. Just pay attention to where the folds are, where there's light hitting and stuff like that, and start building up your highlight layers like that, and just pretend like that rough texture is not there. What I'm doing initially to highlight is I'm just going to be sort of lightening my base color up until I get all the way up to just pure dark blue gray. So, I just add more of the dark blue gray into my base and it gets lighter, and I'm going to do that over several layers. And, you can see, obviously, there's going to be a lot more light hitting the top of this cloak. You're going to want it darker down around the bottom. That's fairly logical, and actually kind of doing this on such a surface is in some ways easier than it would be on a more smooth surface, because the rough texture kind of breaks everything up. It means that you're not going to have to worry about blending as much. It's much rougher, and it actually goes quite a bit faster. once I've got my highlight all the way up to just pure dark blue gray, I'm going to start lightening my colors further. And now I'm just mixing in good old deck tan to that sort of base that I'm using to get just lighter and lighter shades. And you can see, especially as I get to those lighter colors, I'm really starting to focus towards the top of the cloak here. And I'm going to make sure the bottom is purposely darker. Also those edges around where it's sort of touching the interior sort of rawhide, those are also going to get a lot more highlight, but I'm going to be really building up the lighter colors here a lot more. And you can really start to see that because we're painting a really rough surface and you can't really blend it the same way, you can see there's some really clear sort of stark differences between some of the light areas and the darker areas that you wouldn't have on other surfaces. And I know that's kind of annoying right now, but trust me, in the end, it's going to look good. So just kind of follow through, keep highlighting up. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, I should probably say something. I'm also painting sort of the fur tops of his leg wraps, which I did not do earlier, but I'm going to be just doing them in the same way as the fur of his cloak. So, you know, just make sure you don't forget that. You're not going to want to highlight all the way up to just pure deck tan. That's going to be too light. So, you know, you can see here a little bit of my palette. I've just gone up to like a kind of a pleasant sort of light gray shade, but this is really going to be to your taste. And this lightest color in particular, you can see how it's really kind of being used to emphasize the folds and creases towards the top of the pelt. So here's where things start to get interesting. I've made a wash now, which is a mixture of Agarex Earthshade and Nuln Oil. So you can see kind of a dirty brown black oil color, I guess. And I've thinned it down a little bit, and now I'm going to be applying it as kind of a nice sort of even wash all over the entire cloak. You can apply a couple layers if you want, but I would be careful not to go too heavy with the wash on the lighter parts of the pelt particularly. This is just going to help really start to bring contrast and detail back to the sort of the sculpting of the fur, but we're nowhere near done. This is really just a beginning step. Once you've applied sort of the general overall light highlight to the entire pelt, then you want to go back in with a stronger wash of just pure black, really, and start defining deeper shadows and creases. And you're going to need to do this, you know, in several layers, you know, really build it up, especially like, you know, see where the cloak is kind of folded back there. Behind that, you want to make sure you've got really, really dark color. And yeah, just especially like underneath the bottoms of those creases towards the top, just anywhere where you know there's going to be shadow. You want to build up extra layers of heavy wash. You can use some Agarex Earthshade for this too, just to get a little bit of extra variance in tone, but the black is really going to be a lot more effective at this point. And you can see the whole thing, especially up towards the top where we've got those creases, it's not really that unified yet. And the wash that we're applying now, that's going to start to help with that, but we're going to be worrying about that a little bit more kind of in the next step. Now it's possible to paint these sort of rough textured surfaces using just kind of a general highlighting process and then washes, but quite frankly, I don't think it looks as good. And I've seen some large scale figures that are otherwise just beautifully painted, but then you can see the person kind of wussed out when it came to painting fur or hair or something, and they just kind of threw a wash over it, and it really showed that they hadn't spent the same amount of time on it as other parts of the model, and I think that's a really pity. So really, if you want your fur looking the best, you're going to have to do what I'm doing here. I've got a number 0 brush, and I've mixed a very light shade of gray here. It's mostly deck tan. I think I darkened it a little tiny bit, maybe with some of the darker gray. And you can see, especially in the highlight areas, I'm going back with this thin paint, and I'm very carefully building up individual strokes of sort of where the hair needs to fall. And just really sort of just building that up. And it's not going to be enough just to use one color here, because a fur, especially something like this, is going to have more variance of tone. So you're going to want to make several different mixes. So you might have sort of a fairly light color, then you might want to make a even lighter color that you want to use to put extra highlights, particularly on, you know, parts of the fur that are highlighted, and then maybe a slightly darker tone that you can use to pick out fur where there's more shadow falling. And you're just going to want a range of colors, really. You can do a lot of this with just these very sort of light shades like I'm mostly working with here, but it's helpful also to make some very dark colors that you can use too. And if you kind of combine them together in different areas, it's going to help blend sort of those highlighted folds together with the darker shadows next to them. So you basically, you want to be putting some of those lighter little fur streaks down into the darker shadows, even though that seems counterintuitive, because it'll help kind of tie the darker and lighter areas together. And you can also go the other way, take some dark colored paint and streak into the light colored areas a bit to help blend together. What we're really doing here, I guess, is a form of sort of feathering, blending. And this is, I'm not gonna lie, it's enormously time consuming, but it will really make the fur look its best. And this is one of those things where I honestly want to just say, you know, if you, can't do the time, then don't do the crime. So, you know, if you're gonna paint one of these, then you better be prepared to commit to all the kind of annoying stuff like, you know, what we're dealing with here. So now you can see the result of me really extensively applying sort of feathered strokes of lighter grays all over the cloak. You can see it really looks a lot more like a pelt, and you can see that everything feels natural. Those highlighted sort of folds are much more tied together, and everything just works a lot better. Now what I've got is some Agrex Earthshade, and I'm going to be applying again a sort of a pin wash with that to selected areas, more to sort of the darker areas of the model, but also a little bit to the lighter areas. I'm going to keep my wash really thin here. I don't want it to get too intense, you know, particularly on the lighter areas. But what this really does is help add sort of an extra variation in the color, you know, because this is sort of like a wolf pelt, and gray fur is very seldom just pure gray. There's sort of these other warmer tones mixed in there, other colors of fur, and just using this very light brown wash here and there is a really great way to kind of quickly build up some of that extra variation and kind of complexity in the fur. I'm going to move on now to paint some accessories because I'm pretty happy with how the fur of the cloak looks. I've got some German camouflage black brown here, my favorite color of course, and I'm going to be using it to base coat areas like his shoes and his belts and sort of his baldric, various straps like that. Now there's also going to be some kind of gold hardware, like his main belt he wears around his waist is basically made up of kind of brass plates. And any sort of areas like that you plan to paint brass, bronze later on, it's a good idea to base coat them using this color as well. Now I generally like to do all of sort of one type of material surface all at once. So, you know, I would like to just go on and paint all the leather parts simultaneously, but because of sort of various layering issues here, I want to paint his main belt, which is made up of metal plates, before I move on to those areas, because it's kind of underneath everything else. So what I've done here is I've taken some German camouflage black brown, and then I took some Vallejo Air gold, and I mixed just a bit of that in to start creating kind of a very dark metallic base color. Now, what I like about the Vallejo Air Gold here is it's a nice kind of yellowy, kind of brassy, cool gold, which is what I think I really, or thought, I guess, I really wanted on this model, because it just fits in really well. But the problem with the Vallejo Air Gold is it has a tendency to go bad really quickly, so the paint in the bottle will really, I don't know, solidify and thicken and kind of get lumpy real fast. And unfortunately, I did not have any gold paint where that did not happen. So I'm kind of trying to use it here, but once it gets to that point, it really stops working nearly as well. But I'm basically going to soldier on. So after I apply that dark, kind of deep base coat with the metallic, I'm just going to start mixing in more and more of the Vallejo Air Gold, just to kind of build up lighter and lighter sort of metallic shades. And you can see that I'm just kind of doing that here and building it up. And I figured while I was working with the gold, I would paint some other brass areas, like some hardware on his baldric and some little bits on sort of that apron that he wears at his front. I added brighter highlights to the gold just by taking some Vallejo Air Steel, which luckily doesn't suffer from any of the problems of the Vallejo Air Gold, and making kind of this, I don't know, grayish, yellowy, shiny mix, I guess. And you can see I'm applying that to areas where I want there to be a little bit more reflection or a little bit more just brightness. You need to be careful to be pretty sparing with these steel colors, because if you apply too much of them too heavily, and don't keep them thin enough, you're going to end up having your brass look more like silver, which is really, you know, that kind of goes against the whole purpose here. So you want to use it as a very nice thin edge highlight, you know, just to give that sort of final shine to your brass bits. Once that metal belt is taken care of, I can return to highlighting the rest of the leather. I'm using a Vallejo Burnt Umber here, which I've mixed into the German Camouflage Black Brown base coat, and I'm applying that kind of as the first highlight on all the leather areas. And then I'm just going to start gradually building up highlights by mixing in more and more of the Burnt Umber up until I kind of get to pure Burnt Umber. And from that point, I'm then going to be taking some German Camouflage Pale Brown and adding that to the Burnt Umber very slowly to build up some slightly lighter tones. You have to be careful to go real slow, especially when you get to the sort of lighter brown point, because it's really easy to highlight the leather too fast and get too extreme kind of differences in tone. So really kind of take your time and try to just slow down a little bit, because I find that you can't rush highlighting leather, because it tends to look, it just doesn't look natural if you do that too much. But that's not to say that you shouldn't be aiming to get some really nice, very light, kind of subtle leather effects, like especially on the toes of his shoes and some of the wrinkles in the fabric, and especially sort of edge highlights along sort of the extreme edges of the various straps and belts, as you'll see I'm doing kind of as the highlighting progresses. Next, I'm going to work on the scabbard for his gladius. This was generally made out of leather with some sort of brass or silver hardware fittings. So I'm going to be painting the leather base first. My sort of undercoat here is just going to be pure Vallejo burnt umber. And then I'm going to start taking some Vallejo red brown, and that's a really red color, by the way, so be careful not to put too much of it in too quickly, but I'm going to be adding that gradually into the burnt umber to kind of create a distinct shade of leather here that's not going to look like what I used on the belts and straps and stuff like that. And once you get all up a little ways with the highlighting here, you obviously don't want to keep adding the red brown in because you'll get just too brilliant a red shade that you don't want. So then I recommend you kind of start taking the German camouflage pale brown at some point and using that sort of to lighten your color further. And that's, you know, handy, particularly if you want to get sort of a highlight on one side, kind of an edge highlight thing going sort of on that leading side that you can see is sort of facing outwards. Now I'm going to paint the wooden parts on the gladius handle. Gladiuses traditionally, at least many forms of them, tend to have a combination of a wood and bone handle. The grip is made out of bone and the rest is wood. I again here used a base coat of burnt umber, but then I changed things up a little bit. I mixed in just a little bit of my red brown here because I want the wood to feel warm, but I didn't go very far with that. I only really added one sort of subtle layer of the reddish brown shade. And then after that, I started going pretty heavy on the German camouflage pale brown, you can see, to sort of have highlights the wood. And you can go pretty high here, at least in kind of select areas, because you know wood can get very shiny and smooth and polished looking. So I'm adding in that German camouflage pale brown to kind of build up some highlights, particularly again on that leading edge. And then I'm going to even eventually take a little bit of Vallejo ivory and stick it in there to get a really kind of nice pale shade, which I can use kind of to give the sort of impression there's a little sort of shininess, reflectiveness happening on those wood parts. Now to really quickly do the bone grip. I made a base coat here that's a mixture of Vallejo ivory and Vallejo khaki. And I'm just going to apply that to the kind of the whole area, kind of generally. And then in order to highlight, it's just pretty straightforward because it's pretty small. You're just going to want to take probably some pure Vallejo ivory after that and use it to highlight sort of along the tops of those ridges, and just, you know, build it up a little bit. You can blend it here if you're using a small brush. It should kind of go without saying, actually, when you're doing these detail bits on the model, use number 0 brush for pretty much everything. It'll just work a lot better. So anyway, I'm highlighting first with ivory over top of my base, and then I'm going to go back in finally with some pure Vallejo white, which I'm going to use to get a really final edge highlight along sort of the sharp edges of those kind of little turn ridges. I'm going to go back now to painting some more of the brass bronze hardware that we didn't do before, like the bits on his scabbard and those little sort of studs he's got on his apron bits, and whatever else I may have forgotten here. Again, I base coated everything with German camouflage black brown, and I'm using the same highlighting technique I used earlier on the belt. So I'm mixing in Vallejo Air Gold gradually and carefully sort of building that up. And then once I've got it kind of as bright as I can, then I will carefully add a small amount of Vallejo Air Steel into that to add some really bright, shiny highlights. Now, these are some very fine areas, and frankly, I spent an awful lot more time on them than what I'm really showing on camera, just because getting dots like this really even and smooth, it can be really tricky, and not getting it kind of on other areas. And often I found that because the sculpting on a lot of these detail areas is so fine and sometimes kind of unclear, a little bit rough, it's beneficial to go back in with some darker paint like the German camouflage black brown and kind of fine line between some of the different areas. Try to pick out details as best you can, especially those studs on his sort of apron. You may want to sort of line around them with some darker colors to define them. There's a lot of fiddling kind of involved in this whole process, kind of to get a nice looking result. Here I'm painting his pugio and the scabbard for it. These things were, there were a variety of different styles of them, but one of the types that you see a lot, and I think it's very clear this one is of that type, it's just the whole thing is metal. Like the pugio handle is metal, but the scabbard for it is also going to be metal. And I'm going to be painting kind of a steel silver color with some sort of gold accents. So I'm going to be first working on just that base steel color. I just made this here by taking that dark blue gray I was using earlier. I mixed in a bit of black to make it slightly darker, and then finally I made it metallic by mixing in the Vallejo Air steel. So after I applied that base coat basically to the entire pugio very carefully, I'm then going to just start highlighting very simply by adding kind of more and more of the Vallejo steel into my mixture to kind of progressively lighten it in stages, and just keep building it up and up and up until I've kind of hit sort of the top, highest, brightest silver I can get. And just like with the brass, you're probably going to want to go back in here and fiddle with, the details, maybe take some very dark, almost black, very thin to kind of fine line between some of the separate areas to help define them better. Always painting little details like this is a lot of fiddling just to get kind of the best looking results using what is often kind of very limited detail. After I finished the silver kind of part of the pugio, I kind of decided to paint the hardware, so sort of the little hangers on the side and some of the studs on the handle and scabbard, again using brass bronze. And again, same technique as before, base coat with a German camouflage black brown, and then highlight up by mixing in more and more gold up until you kind of hit the sort of gold steel mix that is about as bright as you want to go. And of course, with these really tiny areas, you really have to be careful not to put on too much of those high highlights, because especially in this case, since they're right next to really shiny steel areas, if you put too much steel in there, you're gonna run the risk of making it look like it's all almost the same color, which you really don't want. All right, so here's how our Roman legionary looks at the end of part 3. You can see he looks much more complete. We're really starting to see something that resembles more of a finished model here because we did all those accessory bits and the like. The only thing that's really left on this particular part of the model is to do his helmet, which we'll be looking at next time, along with how to paint his spear, his shield, and also the groundwork, because he came with sort of a small base as well, and we're going to need to mount him and look at how to make all that look attractive. I'm pretty happy with this segment. I'm particularly pleased with how the wolf pelt came out. I'm a little bit less happy with some of the metal details on the model. They were very, very difficult to paint, and partially because some of the sculpting was a little crude on the very smallest areas, but also partially because probably the base kind of primer coat of paint kind of made some of that get a little muddier. I really struggled, particularly with the gold paint, and as I said in the beginning, the gold I had was really kind of going off, and it didn't work very well. So what you see here, this is what it looked like at the end of the video, but I'm not, or I wasn't, still really was not totally happy with it. I felt like the brass looked really too silver in a lot of cases, and particularly on the pugio, it was muddy, it didn't look very nice. So actually, after I finished recording this, I went in with some greedy gold from Army Painter, which is a much more yellow-orange gold shade, and that's why I didn't really want to use it initially, because I felt like it was too warm for this whole model. But I felt like this just really wasn't what I wanted. There wasn't enough difference there. So I went ahead and took a thin mixture of that and used it to sort of gradually add sort of further color and highlights to all the gold areas on the model. And just kind of fiddled with it a lot further. And I think the end result now is a lot better. And you'll see that in part 4 of the video. I'll show you, or you will be able to see what sort of working that extra sort of yellow or gold in kind of did for the model. But I think the main lesson there is this is really an ongoing process, and you may do something and you may come back later and not really be happy with it, and then, you know, try to come up with a solution that makes it look better. These models are really, if you're careful, not careful, I should say, sometimes they just never really even get done. It's almost more like at some point you just have to more give up and stop working on them, because you could if you're not careful, you could really just continue refining and refining, trying to improve and clean up sort of all these little areas endlessly. So, painting 54mm, I think, is kind of a big compromise in that regard. So anyway, sorry for this long digression. I do hope you liked this video. If you did, please like it, share it. Let me know what you thought in the comments. I really appreciate hearing from you. Please also subscribe to my channel if you haven't gotten a chance to do so already. And so that's all for now, and I will see you next time when we kind of get into what I'm hoping will be the final part in painting this model.